Hello and welcome to another Headless Giant podcast. This one's going to be about eunuchs. Eunuchs. Ugh, what a topic. Self mutilation. So there's going to be a lot of trigger words. Let's start here. So, first trigger word that a lot of people are going to be upset with is eugenics, right? So, what is eunuchs in the context of eugenics, right? And what is dysgenics and what is degeneracy, right? These are essential to understanding this topic because I think a lot of people don't have the linkage between the ideas of good breeding, the ideas of eunuchs, the ideas of cults of state, and how these all play together and how they create a more another very strong trigger word, right? These are all related to race, but individually, they have a very prominent meaning. So, thank you for joining me. I don't have any guests tonight, unfortunately. I asked around asking for advice about it, and I did get some advice. I did get some DMs. So, one of the DMs was talking about the cult of Cybele, right? And so, the cult of Cybele was imported to Rome from Turkey or Asia Minor, and it was heavily related to a concept there having to do with the Gali. The Gali are considered the prophets of Cybele, the priests of Cybele, and they had a head priest who didn't castrate himself. Interesting. But all of the adherents of this cult of Cybele and Attis, they had to castrate themselves on, I believe it was March 24th, right? So this idea of Cybele worship is very important for the Sibylline books in the context of Christianity, because the Sibylline books were a group of prophecies that were given to the Romans by this cult of Cybele that had to do with importing certain religions from around the area that would strengthen Rome. So, for instance, this Sibylline cult of the Galli and everything were imported into Rome at a big, massive celebration to help with the Punic Wars, right? So, Rome was facing Hannibal, right? Hannibal was coming over those Alps and he was going to smash all of Rome, and they were terrified. So at that point in time, Rome had banned the process or the practice of self castration, but the Sibylline oracles told them, you need to import the cult of Cybele here and Attis worship. Now, strangely enough, Attis worship is directly related to the Christmas tree, right? So Attis was a god that castrated himself out of sheer madness, right? And that self castration sort of carried over into the concept of the Christmas tree, cutting down the Christmas tree. Putting up the Christmas tree is a form of degeneracy, right? You're taking a living thing, a living pine tree that goes on living, right? And then you're cutting it down and putting it in your house. Interesting, right? That survives Christianity. Now, a lot of people like to point to pagans as being, carrying on this tradition, and it's paganism that carried on this tradition. But really, I mean, the Catholic Church is pretty powerful, and they could have stopped that tradition if they wanted to, but they carried it on, as well as, the practice of having the moral castration of the priesthood, right? So they were no longer allowed to procreate. And you could find that in the book of Matthew, where Jesus says, you should accept the eunuchs. Eunuchs back then meant more than just castration, right? It also means living like a eunuch. That's what the Catholic priests are supposed to do today, is live like a eunuch. It's no coincidence. It comes from Matthew. So this whole process of eunuchification, right? It all plays into the cult of state. So in Rome, these eunuchs would essentially become part of the state apparatus, because what you find in all cases of eunuchs is that they are heavily embedded with the ruling class, heavily embedded. So eunuchs are traded, eunuchs are passed around, and they are used as advisors, especially in places like China and in Constantinople, Eastern Roman Empire. They were basically like, I guess you would call them just bondsman Pokemon, right? So got to catch them all the eunuchs, right? It's interesting because in Constantinople, there was a group of people called the Blues. Now, the Blues were um, a basically like soccer hooligans, right? But the soccer hooligans in Constantinople were these teams, right? And the big rival teams that they had in Constantinople were the Blues and the Greens. And the Greens represented more of like the working class kind of masculine, some soldiers. The idea there is that they were kind of the conservatives, right? And then the Blues were the liberals, and they were, prostitutes and eunuchs. And it's funny, if you go to the secret history inside the court of Justinian and Theodora, he's got something to say about that, right? So basically, the Greens would always try to appeal to Justinian and say, look, you're a man, you've got to do something about this situation. And the Blues would always be embedded with Theodora, right? And so you get this classic dichotomy that we're experiencing today, where basically they look at, politics as sport, right? So politics is the most popular sport today. And what we do is we keep believing that the rhetoric that's thrown back and forth across these aisles represents more than just like WWE smack talking. Well, back then it was much the same way. They would appeal to Justinian when they wanted, some sort of conservative reform coming out of the green soccer hooligans, and the Blues would basically be Theodora's intelligence agency. So anytime she wanted to, she could have people arrested and charged. Her favorite charge was pedophilia and sodomy. So she would charge you with those things and basically throw you in a dungeon until you died and disappeared, no longer existed, torture you to death, right? Because the idea there is that she was both the moral arbiter and the moral destroyer, right? So she had in her party nothing but prostitutes and eunuchs, right? And this brings up the concept of degeneracy, right? In the most basic sense, it's no longer being able to generate. The reason why eunuchs were so highly valued among the upper class is because they couldn't have children, right? So they weren't interested in the future, right? They weren't interested in investing in their own future. They had to invest themselves in somebody else's future to have a legacy, right? They had to be invested in the royal future, right? Let's back up a step and let's look at it from modern perspectives. Where is this eunuchification happening today? Well, it's happening on a state level down to the poor people. And they're saying if you're a eunuch, you're special, or You're LGBTQ if you're no longer producing. You're special. It's no different. No different. That's what degeneracy is. If you're no longer invested in your own future and you're more invested in the future of an agenda, the future of somebody else's policies, you're kind of becoming this state eunuch, right? And Rome had them, but the Roman citizens didn't really participate in this whole unification. What they were was slaves from other areas. Are we seeing a comparison? Yeah, so they were poor and they had to elevate their status, and to elevate their status, they would cut their own manhood off. To elevate their status, they had to cut their own manhood off. You're no longer invested in your own future. You have to fully invest in the cult of state. This is true also with China. China had the 5 laws, right? And one of the 5 laws was if you are, convicted of rape, they would chop your junk off. Well, after you had your junk chopped off, then you could become part of the ruling class because you're not going to usurp them. You're not going to put your own progeny on the throne. And there was a big problem with that, especially in certain dynasties that basically were run by eunuchs and emperor dowagers, right? And an emperor dowager is a widow, right? Back to the blues of the greens, right? So you had the eunuchs on one side and the emperor dowagers on the other, and they were both trying to kill the emperor, right? So they would have these emperors that were like 6 months old when they would die, and then a long stretch before another emperor. And it was just a process of killing off the, poisoning the baby so that either the eunuchs or the emperor dowagers, which would be, married to this baby, right? So they could remain in power, right? And you want to talk about a degenerate society. I mean, that's it. If you're not having the generative family at the core of your belief systems, you're not getting the natural dichotomy, man and woman coming together, producing the future. Does that sound familiar? So in classical, Christian fashion, they take the man, the woman, and they turn into the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Where's this Holy Spirit coming from? Well, they had to take the woman out of the equation because, we don't really accept them as part of our power structure. But, that kind of makes a degenerate system. And what we see is a lot of self-flagellation and a lot of self-hatred coming from Christianity. And you've got flagellants, right, who like to beat themselves up in remembrance of Christ dying on the cross, right? And you've got the priests who are spiritual eunuchs who definitely refer back to that section in Matthew talking about how we should accept the eunuchs, right? And this is how they sort of justify that existence sort of away from the generative principle. And the idea there is that the state wants to kill ambition. They want to kill any challenge to their authority. And if you're invested in your own future, if you're invested in your own progeny, if you're looking at the waves of causality created by having children, you're a threat to the state's current power. Now, once a state gets to a certain level, they don't feel like they have to invest in the future. They just have to control the people right then and there. And every time you see the emergence of the eunuchs as the court spies, as in Constantinople, or the court bureaucrats, as in China, you see a society on the decline, right? Because the state reproduces in a different way than you and I do, right? They don't think about how they can help the family. They're more concerned with how do we stop the family from challenging our authority, right? And that constant process of running up against family autonomy is something you find over and over again. Like Christianity destroyed tribalism in Europe, right? Instead of having tribal loyalties, instead of thinking about your ancestors, instead of thinking about how your ancestors would want you to proceed, they want you in the church. And in the church, you're ruled by eunuchs. I mean, it takes away a lot of that generative potential, right? You're seeing a lot of that generative potential die in just that leap. No longer tribal. Now we only care about the church. That's a big problem. That's a big problem we're going through today. So we're told, we've got to get back to our traditional values of eunuchs. Is that really our traditional values, right? We need to be ruled by eunuchs harder. We didn't get ruled by eunuchs hard enough the first time around, and the degeneracy is taking place, and now we're surrounded by eunuchs. How could this be? They're not looking at the energy of the situation because they're energy illiterate. Now, unfortunately, having energy illiterates means that you've got a 74-year-old up against however the whole hell Biden is, 78 something, right? The energy of that society has crumbled. We're now worried about what soon-to-be octogenarians are going to be doing in slap fights, right? That's all the debates are, is slap fights between really, really old men. It should be like Joe Biden's son, right, going up against Donald Trump's son. But they haven't passed on the power. They haven't passed on the authority. They haven't passed on anything, right? They're not thinking about the future. They're not thinking about building. They're fighting over the ruins that they've created. This is a problem, right? But, when you get to a certain age, you're not really concerned about the future so much, right? We don't have councils of elders anymore trying to direct and guide future generations. We have boomers who are stealing money from future generations. They just keep spending it, right? It's degenerate. It's degenerate. We're not thinking about how to pass on that wealth. We're thinking about how to hoard it until the day we die, right? And they keep producing these articles talking about how bad Gen Z is, how bad millennials are. It's because they like that degeneracy. There's no challenge to their authority there, right? Now, if you're going to start passing on this stuff, that's a problem. We've got to tax that. We've got to tax that into oblivion. Degenerate society, right? These are the ways we pass on our energy, is through our wealth, is through understanding these things, understanding we're not leaving anything for our kids. We're not leaving anything for future generations. This is the idea behind eunuchs, is they don't get to participate in the future. They don't get to guide and shape and lift up these generative forces anymore because they don't have their manhood. They don't have the seed. They can't pass that on. And this is why the state loves them. The state always loves eunuchs. And let's look at our health minister. What's his name? Or her name. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. But we're supposed to believe the lies about COVID. Very degenerative. I mean, let's face it, when you're stopping all economic activity, that's degenerate energy. You're no longer building. You're no longer blooming. You're no longer flourishing. You're stopping all that, right? The activity in our bodies and in our minds is supposed to stop. You're just supposed to stop, right? And our symbol of just stopping all of that is a eunuch. We don't call them eunuchs anymore. We call them LGBTQ, right? And their purpose is to reproduce using the state. And the way the state reproduces and carries forward into the future is by having policies that can no longer be gotten rid of, right? So every new generation has laws that are completely out of date, right? And they never get taken off the books because somebody could use that as a tool of stopping the flow of campaign contributions, right? So if you can use the old laws that should be off of the books to stop somebody else's campaign contributions, why wouldn't you use that? I mean, you're not really concerned with the people who may be suffering. Who the fuck is? I mean, come on. And instead, you're focused more on stopping the campaign contributions to your opponent, right? Again, very degenerate behavior. We're not thinking about the future. Why would we think about the future? That's tomorrow. What are we doing? We can't think about the future. And it's this constant allowing for these eunuchs to plan our future that creates a feedback loop of degeneration, right? Because they're not concerned. Like, for instance, our health general, I guess he's general, right? General. Oh, wow. Let's salute the general, right? Whatever it is. And, it doesn't seem to be real concerned about the future of his kids, right? Who cares? I get to be me. And so we've gone full circle. So instead of thinking in terms of, individual autonomy, individual liberty, individual anything, we're thinking about the feelings of the smallest minority possible, right? So we talk about, libertarians talk about how the individual is the smallest minority. Well, what happens when the smallest minority of the smallest minority ends up getting all of the attention? It's the ultimate navel gazing. Like, these people are not going to be reproducing. They're not going to be creating a future apart from ideologically damaging children. And what do we see in our school systems? It makes sense for the state to only have eunuchs because their reproduction is in policy, right? Policy has to keep damaging the family. It has to. If it doesn't, they might be challenged by a unified public opinion. Let's keep away from that. Let's damage the family so that we don't have to face the wrath of people who have been damaged by the state. You can't get rid of the people damaged by the state so easily. You've got to do things that are just horrible to them to get rid of them. You've got to inject them. You've got to affect their hormone levels. You've got to get them into a much more pliable state of mind. And by doing that, you can have more control. So the idea of the eunuch is always tied to the cult of state. Always. In every situation. I've never seen any eunuchs becoming men of the wilderness, right? Maybe there's some sort of linkage there, right? So when it comes to that concept of eunuch and state, this is what the state produces, right? I mean, if it's no longer concerned with the vitality of its people, because the vitality of the people is the disease of the state, they might resist all of these policies. You've got to stop that. And the best way you can is by making as many eunuchs as possible. And if you psychologically damage them enough, they'll come work for you. If you psychologically damage and physically destroy their ability to reproduce, they'll come work for you. Where's the downside for the state, right? Especially if this is a state that is the most paranoid. I don't care what you say about conspiracy theorists, about how paranoid they are. The state is 10 times more paranoid because it doesn't have an investment in the future people. It has an investment in future policies, right? So anything that challenges those policies is going to be looked at with suspicion, with extreme suspicion. Over and over again, we find that anybody challenging these policies coming out of places like the Pentagon, instead of Congress sort of rubber stamps everything out of the Pentagon. And again, the killing industry is very degenerate. Can we say that? The most degenerate place in the world, trying to hire as many, eunuchs as possible, is the one that's going out there and killing people. And they want people to accept that we're hiring eunuchs. We're hiring eunuchs to work for us in all of these agencies and all of these Pentagon offices, because this is how we reproduce. We reproduce by psychologically damaging people enough to make them physically incapable of reproducing and caring about their own future. The only future we want them to care about is the state's health, right? The state's health minister is a eunuch. What better symbol than that? Eunuchs are the health of the state. And back to Justinian and Theodora for a second. So as we see the blues in Justinian and Theodora becoming this intelligence network for this queen, who is, by the way, a saint. She's a saint. Read Secret History by Procopius about the court of Justinian and Theodora. Read it. Get in there. Get in there deep, because that'll teach you a lot about Christianity. A lot. She's still a saint in the Orthodox Christian church. So all the ortho bros talking about, we got to get away from this, get into the Orthodox Christian church. Yeah, your saint is Theodora, a whore, right? She was a whore. And she became emperor after Justinian had his little fateful death there. And all of the generals said that if he dies, right? If he dies, because he got poisoned a couple of times by Theodora, we will no longer serve the empire. We're going to go back over to Rome. We don't want to have anything to do with Theodora. And she was very clear, I will have total power, right? Very Hillary Clinton-esque. If there is reincarnation, I believe that Theodora is Hillary Clinton. I think so. I think that's why they venerate her so much. She's like a saint in the Orthodox Christian church. Very interesting. Read Procopius. Before you join the Orthodox Christian church, read Procopius, because that is the core of Orthodox Christianity. Not any of the conspiracy stuff you hear from Jay Dyer. That's not the core. The core is the traditions. And the traditions is making a saint out of a literal whore and torturer. Something to keep in mind there. But he's not going to talk about it. Never, ever ask Jay Dyer about Theodora, because he's going to block you immediately. Immediately. Before you get the words out, he will block you. Don't talk about Theodora to him. Doesn't want to hear it. Nevertheless, Theodora had torture chambers built into all of the castles and public buildings in Constantinople. Anything that, they were trying to build to increase their reputation, she put a torture chamber under. And if you were accused by your wife of anything, right, she would take you and put you in these torture chambers. And sometimes she would try to use public shaming to use the, court of public opinion to get you in there. That stopped working. So the public is like, stop killing these men. Why are you doing this? And her response was, they're just going to disappear now. We're not going to even do the whole public trial anymore. I have all the power. This is what I'm doing. So she would take these men and just torture them in there for months and months and months. Not even torturing confessions out of them. She was just horrible. Saint Theodora would torture men to death because that's what she loved to do. She's a feminist icon, by the way. If you look up Theodora, feminist icon, you'll find that that is the model they wish to impose on you today. They love it. They absolutely love it. She was surrounded by eunuchs and whores. The Democratic Party, the Blues. They're literally the Blues. And these repeating cycles of history go over and over and over again because, as it turns out, when you're less invested in your own future and more invested in state power, you turn into a bloodthirsty monster. Yeah, it's weird. I know. How could that be? Because eunuchs are the health of the state, not healthy families. Healthy families is a very bad thing because they can say no. And we want them to not say no, and not say no to a level that they're willing to be special in a way that's surgically special. And let's face it. So the process of creating a fully realized eunuch in today's society is the process of psychic surgery. Psychic surgery. So they're not doing these surgeries out of a necessity at all. It's surgery to help your state of mind. That's called a psychic surgery. So the psychic surgeries and the drugging of the kids who have said that they want to be eunuchs for the state, that's implied. That's implied. That's just going to happen. I mean, let's face it. What better position for a child who has chosen that role in life than a bureaucrat? We find all the bureaucrats just gravitating towards the state. Well, I mean, the eunuchs gravitating towards bureaucracy and then, becoming these high-level positions like the health general health. Once we understand the eunuch process, we can understand the decline of the state because they're no longer interested in healthy families, healthy homes. They're actively involved in destroying the family as much as possible because the new church is the state. The new sport is the state. And this obsession with the state and with controls and with these eunuchs that we have governing us. I mean, you get to a certain age, you're no longer sexually active. I don't want to think about what Joe Biden is doing, but I know it has nothing to do with his wife, Jill. There's nothing going on there. There's no sexual energy. I mean, other than when he's touching kids, which more degeneracy, right? That seems to be the course, right? So we've got the Attis worship in Rome that was looked down on by a lot of people, but they're like the Sibylline books told us. We've got to go for it. We've got Hannibal coming down the Alps. We've got to do something, And That didn't work out too well. But it did carry over to the Catholic Church, where we see the priests acting as eunuchs, which is a reflection of what it says in Matthew. And also we see the eunuchs, massive amounts of them in Constantinople. The Crusaders who came in through Constantinople down into the Middle East were shocked by the vast amount of eunuchs in that city. They were shocked. Just everywhere. Got to catch them all, right? Human Pokemon, basically. Human Pokemon. They're no longer threatening. And we can't forget that in the tradition of singing like little boys, it wasn't encouraged, but if you wanted to keep your career as a singer in the church, gotta lop them off. Lop them off early. So we have this tradition of eunuchification and degeneracy, literally, taking the potential for generations off the table over and over and over again. We can't seem to get rid of this concept because the state always becomes God to these people. They're so involved in destroying and managing everybody else's lives that the state becomes a god. And it shouldn't be any wonder, because if we actually get down to the nuts and bolts about the definition of a god, as I've talked about before, it would be, right, a personification of an area of influence. I used to say sphere or circle, but that's kind of confusing. It's a geometric concept, and let's just say area, right? So an area of influence personified would be a god or a goddess, right? And what you find is the apologists for the state, as they've continued the elitist form of polytheism, is that they say they're not gods or goddesses, they're personifications. Just throw that shit out the window. They're practicing an elitist form of polytheism. Polytheism in the ancient world was a public thing. It was open to everybody. It wasn't about converting people. It was about come to the temple and you'll be blessed, right? They didn't have to go around castrating people or morally castrating people like the priests of Rome. They didn't do that. You come in, you pay your dues, you pray, you leave. It's not something you had to be converted to, right? A lot of these cities, you would go there and you would pay your dues at the patron deity because that's what you did. It was a form of hospitality, right? And for the vast majority of human history, that sort of tradition of public displays of devotion was seen as a good thing. But, again, we have to look at the total reversal. Instead of it being a public display, it became you must be converted, convert or die to our public displays, which is if you're going to be a member of the priest class and you hear the state is ready to go homicidal for your ass, that's a pretty good deal. You're like, yeah, let's go. Bring that Christianity because we can now kill them if they don't come in and pay us. Yeah. Of course, Then the Attis worship basically takes over because it's a cult of state. And so now you've got this eunuch pope, right? Eunuch pope, who's out there trying to get the flock back in, right? Trying to get that flock back in because it keeps dropping off for some reason. Maybe there's none of that vital energy, none of that vitalism, because it's eunuch. It's eunuch state, eunuch church. Go figure, right? We don't have that vitalism because we're not concerned about what happens to future generations. We're not concerned about how anything happens from here on out. We're just doubling down on what got us into this position. Great job. Great job. So the vitalism is on one side where you're concerned about the future, you're concerned about good breeding or any breeding at all, right? Any legacy at all, versus the state eunuch religion. And the state eunuch religion is run by octogenarians who die in their seats because they don't care about passing on anything. They're riding this thing down to the ground. I call it the boomer Millerites. So the Millerites were a group of people in the 1840s who believed that Jesus was coming right now. Jesus is coming. He's on his way. And it's called the Millerites because their pastor that led them to this conclusion had the last name of Miller. So the Millerites sold off all of their possessions. They're like, we're not going to need it. Jesus is coming back any day now. And thousands of people were left impoverished when that didn't happen. Well, the boomer Millerites are sort of like the suburban version of this Millerite thing, where they're like, no, you know what? We're going to keep everything because Jesus is coming back. There's no reason to pass it on. There's no future, right? You're not going to need a house when Jesus comes back. So let's send those weapons to Israel. Get them going. We need to get those red heifers killed before my kids start asking what's going on with all that stuff that you keep spending money on. I'm not going to talk about that. Not going to talk about that because Jesus is coming back. Suburban Millerites. Whew. Yuck. Degeneracy. But what do you expect? This is the first generation, the boomers are the first generations that was raised solely on television, right? Their parents had to both kind of get out there in the workforce because that degenerate inflation make it hard for families, right? And, you got the TV. Put the kids in front of the TV their whole life. What's the worst that could happen? We trust the state apparatus of media. Yikes. So it's not really a big surprise that the first generation raised solely on television is the suburban Millerite eunuch worshippers. Thank you for joining me. I hope you have a little bit more information. Again, look up Addis worship, Sibylline cults, right? Look up, what are they called? I already forgot the name of the priesthood. If you look up Sibylline cults, you'll find it. Addis worship, Sibylline cults. You'll find a bunch of scattered, disconnected pages. Nobody wants to talk about it anymore, but it's right there. And part of the Addis worship was obviously chopping down the pine tree and putting it in your house. Something they carried on with the Catholic Church. Of all the rituals, they had to go with the most degenerate. Isn't that strange? Not really. And look up the eunuchs in China. Eunuchs in China ruled with the emperor dowagers, and they just loved killing those baby emperors so that they could remain in power. It was all ceremonial. Really had nothing to do with the vital energy of ruling a nation. They were just stealing as much as they could get their hands on. What are we going to do? Now they steal through inflation. So that's not helping families out. That's pretty degenerate. It's actually making it way harder. As you know. Also look up the eunuchs in Constantinople, because you'll find out about the blues, you'll find out about the greens, you'll find out about Justinian and Theodora. Read Procopius's secret history inside of the court of Justinian and Theodora. It was suppressed inside the Vatican until the 1600s. Right. It really was the secret history inside the court of Justinian and Theodora for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years. Now we have it. Go get it before they take it away from us again. That's my episode. Thank you for joining me. We got a lot of people. Thank you. 85 people watching. That's amazing. Thank you, and I'll see you again next time.